Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly edition of The Wrap. I'm Laura Leslie, WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief.
And I'm Paul Specht, WRAL State Government Reporter.
It's been some week, hasn't it? We had the House back in town on Wednesday, 200 or so protesters up there with them in the House, lots of police. It was quite a week, but the final veto override of the Cooper administration was, in fact, done at about 4:45 on Wednesday afternoon.
That's right. They were able to strip power from the governor's office starting next year, as well as the attorney general's office and a couple other positions that were won by Democrats in this election. So they will enter office next year with fewer powers than the current office holders have right now.
Right, and that was something that, of course, the protesters were upset about. Incoming Republican House Speaker Dustin Hall, or presumed Speaker Dustin Hall, said on the floor, this is a power that the Constitution gives us, and we are exercising it. Mm-hmm. Of course, whether or not the Constitution actually gives them that power is going to be a question for the Supreme Court to decide, but they do have a lot of friends on the Supreme Court right now.
Right, and it'll be interesting because some of the things they want to do have gone through the courts before. For instance, taking the appointment power of the governor away as it relates to the state board of elections. For whatever, the governor has been able to appoint a majority on the state elections board. And as well, which also means that his party has a majority on the county elections boards. And the Republicans, since Cooper has been in office, I believe, have tried a couple times to change that law.
2016 and in 2018, there was a constitutional amendment that failed 2-1. And I asked more about that on Wednesday night. I said, y'all already tried to do this, right? Mm-hmm. You tried to do it with a constitutional amendment. The voters said no. Why are you bringing this up again? He said, well, this isn't a constitutional amendment. This is just average lawmaking. I guess that makes it better.
I don't know. And no doubt this will go back before the courts as well.
Oh, it's already there. I mean, we already saw the first lawsuit filed about 24 hours after the override, and so that when Cooper and Stein suing over the portion of that bill, there's a lot of stuff in that bill. So there's more lawsuits coming. But the starter was a provision that basically takes the state highway patrol out from under the Department of Public Safety, makes it sort of its own independent department with a captain or a colonel, I should say, that is appointed by the legislature and serves a 10-year term and cannot be fired by the governor.
Why do you think they're doing that?
Gee, I don't know. States like so you got the SBI that's still going to be under the governor, but you got the state highway patrol that would in this case be under the legislature. And Josh Stein and Roy Cooper pointed out that this seems to be a violation of the fact that the governor is the executor of the laws, and so that there should not be a legislative level in between the governor and the head of the state highway patrol.
Right, and my question was what I was getting at there was also there's been some drama between the legislature and Cooper's office over who would lead the SBI.
Yeah.
Right, and so there's that drama in the background. But like you said, there's a lot more things that this does. One of the other things that this bill does is take away the governor's power to increase unemployment checks during a natural disaster or through an executive order. Cooper has gone on into on national media channels this week, or was it last week? It's probably both, like MSNBC, to talk about this, saying, "Hey, rather than getting $300 per week from the state, through my order, you can get up to $600, and now starting March 1st, those enhanced, as he called them, enhanced checks will end."
As I have heard it explained, the law actually doesn't allow him to do that, but he did it under an emergency power.
Right.
And so the provision that's in the bill is sort of like, you weren't supposed to be able to do this. We're not going to argue with you because who wants that optic, right, in this case with Helene? But you're not going to be able to do it again after March 1st. Right. So, yeah.
And I say right not to say that I don't know anything about the law or interpreting it, but I've heard that argument as well.
Yeah. Another big issue this week, the second recount in the Riggs-Griffin race. This is the race between incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs on the Supreme Court and challenger Court of Appeals Republican Justice or Judge Jefferson Griffin, challenging her for that seat on the High Court. She had I think a margin of around 700 votes, And that didn't really change much.
Right.
Actually, she gained votes in the hand-eye sample recount. So they did not order a full statewide recount. So the recount process appears to be over. The state elections board was asked on Wednesday, formally to decide or to rule on a request by the GOP and Griffin to throw out some 60,000 or so ballots. Some of them they said were cast by, for example, dead people, which I covered that in the Wake County. They did count. They did count a couple.
We both
of those.
covered that.
Yes,
I sat there all day and listened to some of their arguments about that.
And then there were some they said that were counted that were felons who had not yet finished their sentence. But the vast majority of those folks are folks who registered to vote and who at the time were not required to give a driver's license number or social security number.
Right, and that dates back, I think, decades, right? Or almost
2004.
Yeah. 20 years.
And some other people said that they were singled out, and all of their stuff is on file. I mean, they're complete. They went and verified that with the Board of Elections, so it's not clear at all why these people were singled out unless their names were similar to someone else. It's hard to say. But at any rate, the State Board of Elections denied that petition. So that can, of course, go before a judge, and that's exactly what's going to happen pretty much, I would guess, Monday.
And it wouldn't shock me if a decision is still not made then. I mean, when it could be 2025 before we hear.
I have a feeling it'll be February, April before this is all settled.
Wow.
I really, the way this thing goes, it wouldn't be North Carolina if the elections went smoothly, right?
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, that's our state motto right there.
We're going to take a break for just a second here to pay some bills. We'll be right back on the other side. Stay with us. And we're back at NC Capitol Wrap for this week, Friday the 13th. That doesn't sound good.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Lots going on this week, though, including a bunch of different oversight hearings at the legislature. And you and I sat through some of those. A lot of this was targeted at really trying to get a better handle on what kind of damage different sectors have experienced from Helene.
That's right. And they've talked about one thing we've heard talked about a lot is businesses and the best way to come in and provide relief for them. Governor Cooper, when he rolled out his proposal, which of course has not been adopted because he's a Democrat and the legislature's full of Republicans, was business grants, sort of like the PPP loans during the COVID era. And one thing we saw this week was Republican House Speaker Tim Moore and a few others, Republicans, went up to D.C. to argue for federal relief. About $26 billion is what they're asking for. And that's one thing that Speaker Moore and others spoke to you and I about, is hoping for some sort of business grant or loan program.
From the federal government.
From the federal government where, if it's a grant, great. If it's a loan, make it easy to pay off, or a super low interest rate, or something
like
easy
the
to deal
PPP,
with.
which was
right.
a forgivable loan,
right? Forgivable loan, and so that's a lot of what they're talking about. And then the oversight hearing, they've also talked about just how the state budget director said, even if the state gets all of the money it's requested, like on paper, they've done $1 billion worth of relief through bills in the state legislature. If they get the $26 billion from the federal government, that's $27 billion right there. Cooper has asked for, I think, $3.9 billion. They're not going to grant his request, but it's requested. That puts them at about 30. And then the state budget director says they expect another $6 to $7 billion in private investment to help the state recover. That puts us at about $37 billion. Well, guess what? The total figure of damages to get North Carolina back to where it was, as if nothing happened, they estimate to be between $53 and $57 billion. So even if we're granted all this money we're asking for, from the governor to the legislature, all this stuff, we're going to be $20 billion short still.
Well, incoming Speaker Dustin Hall told me on Tuesday, he was up in D.C., and we were lucky enough to catch a Zoom with him and Representative Dudley Green. He said, $50 billion sounds like a lot of money, but to the federal government, it's really not. He said, we send that kind of money overseas all the time. He said, what I hear from people up here is that they're understanding we got to take care of our people first. So I think he's hoping that the feds are going to come through with more than what we're talking about here. Of course, that remains to be seen. And, I did ask whether we're competing with other states in terms of asking for this relief because, of course, Helene plowed a pretty broad path through Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, But apparently none of the other states has damage that was quite as widespread because it didn't hit the mountains in the other states.
And that's one thing that keeps coming back up. You've heard on the House and Senate floor where they say no one expected this. In fact, one of the things they pointed out during the one of the oversight hearing on this was that 95% of people in the mountains who were affected did not have flood insurance
because they didn't need it as far as they knew.
If had I lived up there, I would not have signed up for flood insurance.
Right, you're up on the side of a mountain. I mean, come on.
Right, unless I'm right there on the French Broad. And so maybe we'll get lucky and find some sympathetic ears up in Washington. We'll see.
There's also the damage to the agriculture sector, which was the topic of another meeting on Tuesday. A lot of discussion about sort of the depth of the damage, because this wasn't just a question of damaging crops.
Right.
This was a question of literally erasing topsoil.
Right.
Like you have entire farm fields that are now rock because all the floods and the mudslides came through and took out the dirt that was there that they were using to grow crops. So not only do they have to start from scratch with the crops, they're going to have to rebuild the field itself.
It's so crazy to think about. And we've heard that in other contexts too. When we spoke to Speaker Moore, he said there are some people's property that has been changed forever by the landslides. And so where they used to have a flat pad to put their house, it's now rocky or it's now sloped. And so they're going to maybe they'll be able to bring in a bulldozer and flatten it. But in some cases, maybe not. It may be changed forever. You can't build back. And so you talked about, we're seeing the same thing in some of these fields where people farm is, it's not just, this one crop is gone, plant again next year and come back. No, you need the soil to be a certain depth and have the right pH and all this. And it's changed. It's changed for what they think will be many years.
Yeah. And we also heard a little bit about unemployment relief in Helene, and they were saying that it was Antoine Keith, who's the undersecretary, I think, or assistant secretary for employment security, was saying that they have spent more money right now on disaster unemployment aid than in Helene than they did in Florence, Fred, and Matthew put together.
That's right.
That's how more widespread the damage was up there. He said that's all flowing pretty quickly now, but there was a bit of a delay. He said they had requested that FEMA authorized this disaster aid on October 3rd. He said they didn't actually get that approved till the 22nd of October.
That's right.
And I asked him, I said, well, do you know why? And he said, no, I don't. He said, but I was blowing up their phones.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine it's frustrating for them. They were actually, the unemployment office was pulled in to this hearing because they had received 2 bad audits from the state auditor's office, which we wrote about, for sending out checks late, unemployment checks late. And what Mr. Keith said was that in the calendar year 2024, they had started to turn it around. They had gotten their responsiveness much, much better. And then Helene hit and everything's complicated. And then, you're asking for disaster funds to help with, financial relief. And they waited, 20 days from the federal government. So he said they're doing things, though, that they've never done before. You heard him say, some of it's automated when you call people and ask them to fill out their paperwork. People who apply for unemployment checks, they have to fill out weekly paperwork that involves, writing about what jobs they're looking for.
Did you go looking for a job?
Right.
Where, et cetera.
And they extended the deadline so that I believe he said they have 28 days to fill out 1 week's worth of paperwork instead of, 1 week or 2. And their staff is making a point to call everyone multiple times just to say, what can we do? And another thing he said was in Western North Carolina, there are a lot of self-employed people. There are a lot of contractors and people that sort of do that blue-collar work. And he said if they lost their house, they can't find those documents that they need to fill out this paperwork.
Of course not.
And so they got permission to work with the Department of Revenue to obtain some people's records. Some people may sound like a little Big Brother-esque.
I think they had to have approval.
Right.
But
It sounds a little Big Brother-esque, like, we'll go find your records.
But no, that's the only way they could prove what they were making.
Right. They sort of had to have this new unprecedented relationship with the Department of Revenue where they said, hey, can you please give us just this small amount of information we need to fill out this form? And so I think that's helped them too.
Yeah. A couple other things to point out, things of note. We had exit interviews this week with Governor Roy Cooper. Deborah Morgan handled that. And I talked to outgoing state school superintendent Catherine Truitt. Said that, her parting words were that education has gotten all way, way, way too political.
Do you mind if we do a refresh on what happened to her?
Yeah, so she was hoping for a second term, but
she's a Republican.
She is a Republican, but she's always been more of an educator and a policy wonk than she is a politician, right? And so she basically got outflanked on the right by Michelle Morrow, who didn't have a lot of money and wasn't running a lot of ads, but basically showed up at every county Republican Party meeting and talked to people and did it the old-fashioned way, retail politics, and it worked. And she beat Catherine Truitt in the party primary, which really astonished a lot of people because I don't think a lot of people really saw that coming, including Catherine Truitt.
Right.
So she, was hoping for a second term. She did not get it. So she is staying. She says she's going to be staying in education for the time being. So when I asked about political aspirations for the future, that wasn't necessarily at the top of her list right now. That's perhaps understandable given the circumstances.
Right. I think they probably didn't take. I've heard some people say they perhaps didn't take Morrow seriously enough, given Morrow's own background as someone who was at January 6th and who has been deeply skeptical of the public education system. And which two reasons she probably went on to lose in the general election to Democrat Mo Green. So, I wouldn't blame her if she didn't want to return to politics very soon.
Well, her upshot was, her parting words were, look, education just needs to get back to the center. So that's where most parents are. That's where most educators are. They're not far right. They're not far left. They're not looking to get out there and ban books. They're not trying to teach kids about transgenderism in third grade. They're just center. And she said, and that's really where our policymakers ought to be too. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I think that wraps it up for us this week. Not sure if we'll have an episode next week. I guess that depends on what they get up to.
That's right.
It should be a quiet week, but that's always a jinx, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It is Friday the 13th too, so it's like a double jinx.
Oof. All right. Well, cross your fingers and don't walk under any ladders, and tune in next week, and we'll catch you up here on The Wrap. Thanks for listening.